My name is Michael Kenny. I'm a professor of international affairs here at the University of Pittsburgh, where I also direct the Matthew B. Ridgway Center for International Security Studies. You've reached the virtual event that we're doing today, Anti-Fascism in America. First, a piece of housekeeping business. We are recording. We're hoping to put this out to our channels afterwards. Okay, so just keep in mind we're recording. You will have the opportunity to submit your questions on the chat. So we've got a chat up and running that's being moderated and vetted. And depending on how the conversation goes with my two guests, we do hope to get to some of your questions. Okay, so we're going to start. And I'm delighted to be joined today by two guests. We have Dr. Mark Bray, Assistant Professor of History at Rutgers University. He's actually joining us from quite a distance. We're going to hear more about that story later on. Our second guest today is Comrade Rizzy Campbell, who is a veteran street activist and left-wing organizer with a lot of experience in this area. Mark is most famous for writing this book, Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook, and we are going to be digging into that book and again talking about the most unfortunate story of why he's joining us from so far away. But first, why? Why are we doing this? Why is Michael Kenny hosting an event called Anti-Fascism in America, during this moment? Is he being deliberately provocative? Is he trying to stir the pot? Like, what's going on with him? There's two reasons why I wanted to do this event. One is truly in my capacity as director of the Matthew B. Ridgway Center for International Security Studies, because I don't know if you know who this guy was, but he was pretty impressive. Matthew Ridgway was one of the leading anti-Nazi generals in World War II. He ran the 82nd Airborne Division during the war, during Normandy. In other words, he was the one in charge of sending our best and our brightest behind enemy lines in Nazi-occupied France to support the Normandy invasion. Now, if that ain't an anti-fascist, I don't know what is, because he was willing to sacrifice everything to fight fascism. In that tradition, I decided to host this event, and I'm glad I did. The second reason why I decided to host this event is simply because we can. Academic freedom is essential to universities like the University of Pittsburgh. If we don't stand for academic freedom, what do we stand for? This is an opportunity to have a controversial event on a controversial topic, not for its own sake, but for its educational value. We're going to learn a lot today. So sit back, get your popcorn, and let's get into it. I'm going to jump right into questions. I want to start with Dr. Bray. Mark, you've obviously done a lot of work on anti-fascism research. You wrote the book I just showed. There's a couple other books I believe you can see behind me. So you're quite prolific, actually. And you're widely considered to be an expert on anti-fascism and fascism. So tell us, what is fascism? What is anti-fascism? Help us understand these dual phenomena.
Sure. Well, first, Michael, thank you for having me. Thank you to Rizzy for participating. Thank you to everyone at the Ridgway Center, and thank you all for tuning in. Yeah, in order to understand anti-fascism, it's good to start with fascism. Now, fascism is notoriously difficult to define, in part because historically fascists have adopted and abandoned ideas with much more ease and comfort than advocates of other ideology, in part because they reject rational consistency as an important foundation of how they organize their beliefs. Historically, famously, Mussolini said something to the extent, if I contradict myself, well, I don't give a damn. So that's worth just like as like a kind of a baseline. Now, I like to think of it historically. I'm a historian. Mass politics, as we think about it, of big political parties, big demonstrations, youth organizations, organizations for different demographics like women's organizations or workers' organizations, that really developed in the 19th century as the from the left of the political spectrum, through the workers' movement, through different kinds of socialist, anarchist, and other kinds of movements. So I think one of the important things to understand with fascism is that fascism was the first meaningful right-wing attempt to take the mass politics pioneered by the left and use it to transform society. So it matters that Mussolini started his political career as a socialist. But in the context of World War I, he and his allies changed the innermost content of socialism. Instead of internationalism, they advocated ultranationalism. Instead of antagonism towards participating in World War I, they glorified military participation to the point of considering violence not just a lamentable necessity in their political struggle, but something that had inherent value and that transformed the fascist subject into this kind of new fascist man. So what I'm getting at is thinking about how fascism was an effort to take popular politics, change the content of socialism to be nationalist, militarist, misogynist, racist, and imperialist, and use this form of modern politics to paradoxically destroy the modern world created by the French Revolution. So there's a sort of a back to the future aspect of fascism, of having this nostalgia for this imagined past. There's always a desire to return to the past, but using modern forms of politics to get there. They also have always or often considered themselves as this kind of third alternative between capitalism and communism. When they've actually pursued power and gotten into state power, they've always advocated, always sided with the elites, but there is part of that rhetoric. And so ultimately, I think we can understand it as this kind of militaristic, ultra-nationalist form of authoritarian politics that um, makes the case. I mean, the phrase "Make America Great Again" is such a short, succinct encapsulation of this kind of ultra-nationalist, really fundamentally fascist outlook. Um,
Good,
as
good. Because
as
that
far
that was
as
actually my follow-up. Great historical overview. Thank you. I just learned something from that. That's good. But like you just started to apply it to the current situation. So that was actually going to be my follow-up to you. So all right, so we have this history, but how does that apply today to today's situation? Go ahead.
Right. Well, I mean, the story gets much more complicated when we continue the history after World War II. And I am going to get to the present day, but I'm a historian,
Yeah,
so it
but I
takes a minute
now
to get.
now no, we're going to skip over that. Let's go right to I want
All right.
you.
The short
Okay.
version is fascism changes.
Yes,
So it's not the same as it was in the 20s and 30s, and that is pertinent to analyzing today. But you want me to jump to today? I'll do that. So
I do.
um, I think that MAGA is a fascist movement. There was the big debate 8 years ago, is Donald Trump a fascist?
Right.
I, at the time, said I thought he was fascistic insofar as I think he checked a lot of the boxes, but fundamentally, I've never been convinced that he actually cares enough about political outcomes to
Yeah.
call him a fascist. I think he cares about his own wealth and power and fame and has
Mm.
realized that far-right politics are a useful vehicle towards that and has surrounded himself, particularly in his second administration, with actual fascists. So I say that to emphasize that I think at this point, what is in his actual heart and mind is probably less relevant than the trajectory that his administration is following at this point,
Mm.
which is clearly a desire to paint the Democratic Party as Stephen Miller called it, an extremist political party that advocates for terrorism, which is obviously an effort to delegitimize the party and I think ideally eliminate the party. Their enemies on the left are called terrorists either by virtue of their alleged affiliation with Antifa or their alleged affiliation with Hamas. Their international enemies like Maduro in Venezuela are terrorists. So to me, there's a clear effort to attack democracy, to paint the enemies of the administration as terrorists, which of course is a way to delegitimize them as political actors and to create an excuse for eliminating from them from the social sphere. And then, if you want to talk about the kind of explicit white supremacist politics and misogyny and so forth, there is so many of the historical hallmarks are evident there. But I think it would be a mistake to assume it's going to look and sound exactly the same as the 20s and 30s because it'll change.
That makes sense. That makes sense to me. Now, there is one condition that you have not mentioned that to me is a necessary condition for a government to be called fascist, and that is single party dictatorship. Could you speak to that?
Sure. Well, to be clear, I do think that the goal is what you just described, but they've
Okay.
not achieved it yet. They've not achieved it yet. All right. So when we talk about is there fascism in America, there's two related but distinct things that can mean, right? The one thing is what you just said, which is the full-blown version where we can't have an event like we're having right now.
Right.
And then there's the sort of the movement aspiring towards that, which I think the movement is underway. I think it hasn't moved as quickly, I think, as some would like on the far right, but it is aspiring towards the other version. So I don't think that we have it in that full-blown sense, in part because, we with No King's Day, we had 7 million people protesting. The Democratic Party still exists, et cetera, et cetera. So the challenge here, I think, is to thread the needle, connecting those two interpretations of what fascism in America means, and talk about where we are in a process that could potentially be moving in that direction.
Yeah, I get that. Thank you. All right. You know what? It's 12:15, gentlemen. I want to jump to the second question, which Comrade Rizzi is going to take the lead on. So the second question is, what is the relationship between anti-fascist activism and political violence? Given this scenario that Dr. Bray has just described, which I assume you mostly agree with, if maybe entirely, is violence now legitimate? If not, under what conditions is political violence, and you can talk about whatever form that may take, what that means to you, is it legitimate? Is it okay to punch a Nazi in the face?
Yes, hi. So thank you for having me. First off. But to answer your question, is political violence necessary and legitimate? And what's its relationship to anti-fascism? So first off, anti-fascism is simply a political belief that fascism, wherever it may arise, needs to be met and stopped before it is allowed to progress to the point where we find ourselves today, to where it finds itself in a position to, change the lives of millions in a very, very bad way. The idea that you can, debate fascism away, that you can vote it away, that it can be reasoned with, has already been shown throughout the entire, last century to not be the case, to the detriment of millions and millions of innocent lives. And so anti-fascism simply is the belief that wherever that starts to crop up in society, it must be met and stopped with any means necessary, whether that, can be debated away, or if it can't, which it shown that it can't be, physically stopped by people on the left that realize it can't be allowed to take hold. And so that can look in a lot of different ways. That can look like protests and counter-protest conflicts that progress into violence in that sense. But it looks like a reaction to whatever form fascism is taking in that particular society. So if they're out willing to be violent in the streets, we're willing to be out just as violent to stop them, to protect people behind them. If they want to progress it to where they are now and having masked men round people up, we need to find a strategy and organize in a way to stop that however we can. Is it okay to punch a Nazi in the face? It is, and I can't be more clear, it is always okay to punch a Nazi in the face anytime, anywhere, under any circumstances. They need to be afraid to show their face in public. And yeah, so anti-fascism is just the response to those characteristics that Dr. Bray just described, and stopping them from being allowed to take hold.
Okay, so punching a Nazi in the face is okay. What about breaking a Starbucks window, like if that's part of a larger protest?
Yeah, that's I have no problem with that. Violence against a thing, isn't, I don't consider that really violence. Like, it is a political act in itself. When you have a capitalist system that controls every facet of our lives, through a monetary lens, striking back against that and not harming another person in the process, I feel is completely legitimate.
Okay, what about going to protest at an ICE facility and I don't know, torching, like hitting an ICE vehicle, setting it on fire at an ICE facility?
So I'm going to be very careful here because I don't want to come across definitionally like I am advocating.
No, we're talking
violence.
hypothetically. We're talking hypothetically. We're not talking about anything
hypothetically.
Totally hypothetical.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So hypothetically, in this scenario, real human lives are being destroyed. Human families are being ripped apart by people with masks as agents of the state, hunting people of color and living their everyday lives. And so that is violence. That is terrorism. That is ruining people's lives. Setting on fire one of the vehicles they get in to do that and ruin these lives is, I don't care either way.
Okay. Next scenario. Thank you. Good. Thank you. Next scenario. Let's say you do a protest at an ICE facility and you got some folks, doing their thing, just protesting in front. Then the ICE folks start coming out. Meanwhile, there's one or two people, a couple of 100 yards away, and they start taking pops at the ICE people that come out. They literally shoot the ICE people or the law enforcement that respond to the protest. They've left the facility. They're now outside. They're clearly identified as law enforcement. And then you have these two other dudes with, rifles, and they are shooting specifically at those two law enforcement officers.
Well,
is that
Michael, at this point, we're not talking about a hypothetical. You're talking about the case in Texas.
Yeah, of course. Okay, then let's just call it what it is.
For what it's worth, I'm not convinced that it's worth discussing what the state claims happened at this facility when we don't know exactly what happened, and this case is being used as an example to attack the entire anti-fascist movement.
Right.
So for what it's worth, Rizzy, it's your choice. I would be reluctant to comment specifically on this specific case in that way, but
okay. But
yeah,
so thank you for that. Thank you for that. So here's my response to that. You're absolutely right. That is what I was driving towards. You're absolutely right. That's the case I have in the back of my mind. But this is what we're dealing with, boys, right? This is it. Now, Mark, your point is well taken. We are still a country of law and courts, and the individuals that have been arrested in that event, they are due their day in court. We don't know what happened, right? I've read accounts where the two snipers, they tricked the other protesters. It could be a situation where you had people who thought they were going to a protest. They weren't told about what was going to happen. And then all of a sudden they're hearing shots. So people might have been manipulated. They might have been lied to. We don't know what happened. Okay. So that's a fair point. However, it's still a legitimate question. And the question is it okay to shoot a law enforcement officer under that sort of circumstance? It's a fair question. We're talking about political violence.
So this gets at kind of a part of what anti-fascism is, as a political ideology and counter movement to fascism. And it is no structure, no set of specific goals other than stopping fascism.
Okay.
I do not specifically, I do not take the state's word on anything. They have shown consistently time and time and time again that they lie. They will lie for their own benefit. They will frame people. They will plant evidence. They will manufacture evidence. And so I have no place to comment on what another small segment or affinity group within anti-fascism has decided is a necessary step to take for their specific set of circumstances. I do highly doubt the state's version. And I do reiterate that whatever form fascism takes, it is legitimate to meet it with equal and reciprocal force back. And so that's
one of the things, if I could interject, is that we don't know if the people who are accused of doing those things consider their actions to be anti-fascist actions.
Yeah, that's another possibility, right?
Right.
Yep.
Right. So there are other political trajectories to have come at the kinds of things these people are accused of doing. So that is another germane part of it, just to throw out there.
Yeah, that's a fair point too. So thank you both. Let's move on. Actually, Rizzy mentioned something that interests me, and so now I'm bringing up a new question. So we're all going to think on our feet here, but it just because Rizzy just said that he doesn't want to comment on what which we don't know. To Mark's point, we don't know that it was actually an anti-fascist group. Like there have been some suggestions, maybe, but we don't know that for a fact. Okay, fair enough. But if Rizzy's comment is still valid, like he's saying, I don't want to comment on what another self-identified anti-fascist group in another part of the group of the country is doing, that gets to my question, okay? Is there a national leadership structure to anti-fascism in America? Is there some sort of secret cabal or, I don't know, individual or group of individuals behind things who are kind of, funding it, sending lots of money? How does it even work? How can you have, all these different groups that are doing their thing if there's not some sort of mastermind behind it? There must be some sort of national leadership structure. There must be some sort of deep pockets going after that's funding all this. And I don't care who tackles that first.
Can I take a stab at it, Mark? So if there was a big leader, big CEO of Antifa Incorporated, don't you think like the Inspector Gadgets, your Andy Knows, you're on the right wing that have just been dying to pin, something like this up? Don't you think they would have come across anything over the past couple decades or however long they've been trying to, pin a face to what they say it is, and while offering no evidence? For one. Second, it's not that expensive to do what we do. Like it's, you and a couple of friends who share the same beliefs, figuring out how you can use the resources available to you to be the most effective against this force that is, barreling towards us all. So no, there is no leadership. There doesn't need to be leadership other than everybody realizing that this is what fascism is, whether it be loosely or specifically. This is what it will become in society. And we all agree that, like, we got to stop it however we can stop it. Let's all figure out the best ways we can stop it. And however that looks, it looks. You don't need a commander to tell that.
The other thing to throw in there is this is an accusation that's been thrown at any kind of decentralized bottom-up mass movement. Occupy Wall Street in New York City, and there was the same accusation was like the right can't imagine that thousands of people can kind of operate democratically and do something without a command structure. And the accusations around George Soros were thrown out then, they're thrown out now. I think they're also thrown out during the anti-war movements of 20 years ago. So, it's kind of the same refrain. And in that sense, Antifa is more of a politics or a term or a description or an action or a milieu than it is like a solid organization.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's I have to say, as somebody who's been doing research on anti-fascism and anarchism in America since 2018, that's consistent with what I've found in my research, my interviews, my participant observation. It's very decentralized, and that is interesting to me as a student of terrorism and political violence because that's actually consistent with how many terrorist groups, ecosystems function today. On the far right, you see the same thing. You see the same thing. You've seen the same thing literally for decades among the eco folks. This is sometimes called leaderless resistance in the terrorism studies community literature. I don't want to be misread here. I'm not saying you're terrorists. That's a separate question. I'm just saying that this organizational principle of organizing through decentralization is an established organizational model that has been adopted by not only folks on the left, it's been adopted by folks on the far right, and there's a long tradition in this. Let's move on. Now I do get to ask you the terrorist questions. Look, we've been all following the news, right? We're aware of what's happening. It's particularly the Trump administration's efforts to declare Antifa as a terrorist organization. You two don't need me to tell you that goes back to his first term. He tried to do this. He actually made efforts to do that. At that point in time, he was surrounded by establishment Republicans. He didn't have quite the leeway that he has today. As Dr. Bray pointed out in his opening remarks, it's just different now. He surrounded himself with loyalists who are willing to do pretty much, from what I see from the news, pretty much anything he wants. So this time, when the president says, I want to declare Antifa as a terrorist organization, it actually has traction now. Rightly or wrongly, it has traction, and we are moving in this direction. Obviously, the most recent event that pertains to that is from late last week. I think it was Friday that the Trump administration announced that they've actually identified 4 international anti-fascist groups, one in Germany, Antifa Ost, which I think is the same one you mentioned at one point in here. You got one in Italy, the famous FAI. You have 2 in Greece, Armed Proletariat Justice and Revolutionary Class Self-Defense. So now they have gone from just saying we are going to designate them to now they're actually starting to do that. I think they're going to start with the international groups before they go to the domestic ones. I believe that will be the next step. So given all this, now I get to my question, which is, are you a terrorist? I don't know who wants to take the lead on that.
Well, I just went, so Mark, you could start it, and then I'd like to be able to
Well,
follow up.
Rizzy,
Rizzy, let's start with you. Rizzy, you
All
go.
right. All right, all right. So, am I a terrorist? No. When you think about terrorism, you have to follow the academic definitions of it. There is not. It doesn't seek to instill fear and intimidation in a wider audience. It doesn't use attacks against civilians or non-combatants. The only people it seeks to influence, it doesn't seek to influence populations at large. It only seeks to influence fascists, and that is what the main goal of it is. And so, if someone is declaring the movement to combat fascism as terrorism, what does that say about those, in the state that are calling you fascists or are calling you terrorists? So, no, I do not consider it terrorism. And if it is terrorism to resist an ideology that will, if allowed to flourish, result in a genocide of what could be millions, if that is terrorism, well, then I guess guilty is charged on that one. But yeah, it doesn't meet the definitions of terrorism academically. It doesn't meet it from a actual in practice tactics and standpoint. So it only meets it from the state saying it. And we know their track record on saying things that turn out to be objectively true. It's not good.
Yeah,
If
I
I
mean, it reminds me of, during World War II, the Nazis called the French resistance terrorists.
Right.
Historically, Mark could give many more examples, I'm sure. Like the state will, particularly a certain type of state, an authoritarian state will often be quick to delegitimize its adversaries and try to portray them as terrorists. I'm reminded of when the Ukrainian resistance blew up that bridge that led to Crimea. No sooner had that happened than Vladimir Putin is, oh, this is terrorism. This is terrorism. I'm sorry, Mark, your turn.
No, it's fine. Just on the factual point around the European groups, like Antifa Ost in Germany, obviously Antifa's in the name. The informal anarchist federation in Italy is really kind of a very loose network of insurrectionary anarchist groups. They attack the state, they attack the police. It really bears no particularly meaningful connection to the tradition of militant anti-fascism. If you look at the State Department's description of the two Greek groups, they describe them attacking the state. And for the most part, the tradition of militant anti-fascism has been directed towards small and medium-sized far-right groups in subcultural communities, in football stadiums, in neighborhoods, far-right groups attacking immigrants. Despite what the Trump administration is saying, is not actually a strategy for overthrowing the state. Many of the people who participate in these groups would like to do that, but they pursue that through other forms of organizing and activity. So that's a long way of saying only one of these four groups has much of anything to do with Antifa whatsoever. There are a lot of Antifa groups in Europe. I think the Trump administration just doesn't know anything about them. And they looked at examples of political violence that were in the news. They picked four groups because it serves their purposes. And then, as you said, it's a stepping stone towards declaring Antifa to be a terrorist organization in the US. And Michael, I don't know what your 2 cents are on this, and I'm sure it would take us beyond what we have time for, but I'm skeptical of all definitions of terrorism.
Yep.
um, because I think at this point, it's more than anything, it's just a way to demonize political violence that you don't like.
Yeah, it has been used that way. I'm sure you and I could have an absolutely fascinating definition of what
Another event,
terrorism is.
another
Another
event.
day, another event,
Yeah.
another event. Absolutely. I do agree with Comrade Rizzi's points, particularly him identifying the wider audience is really crucial. But yeah, we could spend all day on that. So those are great points about the international groups. So let's push this another step, which is again what I wanted to add is I don't even know if they're necessarily going to news reports. I think they're probably going to people like Andy Ngo and Jack Prozobiec or whatever his name is. They had an event at the White House a few weeks ago. I'm sure you saw that. They had all those, if you could say anti-Antifa influencers there. My guess is they're just going to them and saying, okay, who is it? Now, if that's true, then I fully expect Rose City Antifa to be among the first groups, domestic groups, that gets tagged with the terrorist designation. And I say that because that's where Andy Ngo, that's where he became famous, was engaging in his journalism in Portland, supposedly documenting what was happening there. He always seemed to have a particular spin on it, but at any rate, yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's any reaction to that comment from either of you. Okay, all right, let's move on. All right. Okay, you know what, Mark? I want to turn to your story. And then after we talk about Mark's story a little bit, then I'm going to turn to any questions that we've gotten. Okay, so now is a good time to put your question in the chat. I got my my great colleague Zakira's in another room. She's going through these questions. She's only going to send me the best ones, guys. So if you send me a crazy question, it ain't even going to get to me. So send us your best question that's related to what we're talking about today, okay? But first, Mark, I want the audience to hear more about your story, about why you find yourself in your current situation. Give us the background.
Sure.
What's going on?
Right. So I published Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook back in 2017. It became controversial. I received a number of threats back then as well. But that faded into 2018, 2019. I moved to New Jersey. I started working at Rutgers. I started actually researching other topics altogether. I think things really changed after Charlie Kirk was killed. It seemed in the immediate aftermath that President Trump was determined to blame the left, even though they didn't know at the time who had killed him. And even when they found out it was Tyler Robinson, whose his politics I don't think really can be easily categorized in one box or another. He's more influenced by video games and so forth. There was a concerted effort to use this momentum, I guess you could say, generated by his killing. And so then you see the executive order declaring Antifa to be a domestic terrorist organization, although that doesn't actually carry legal weight. 4 days later, the Department of Homeland Security issued a memo attacking the Antifa-aligned individuals and groups, so already expanding a term that was rather vague to begin with in a broader direction. That's around the time that some of the far-right influencers you mentioned started calling me a domestic terrorist professor on X. I got the first threat saying someone was going to kill me in front of my students. I moved my classes online. More and more far-right influencers started calling me a terrorist.
When was that specific threat? When you had to decide to move your classes? When was that?
September 25th, something
Okay.
like that.
Yeah. Okay.
26th, something like that.
Yep.
Then Turning Point USA, the local chapter at my school, started a petition to have me fired on similar grounds. Even though at the time the petition had fewer than 100 signatures, Fox News ran an article about it. And that's when the few death threats turned into many more, and someone sent a threat with my home address. So I have two small children, and I had to leave my home. I considered going elsewhere in the US, but the threats continued. Someone posted my address on X, and I'm a historian of Spain. My second home in the world is Spain. So I was concerned about what was happening. I was also concerned about where this country might be heading in the future. So I decided to leave. I ran into a few problems when I first went to the airport. When I was at the gate ready to leave, someone mysteriously canceled my family's flight reservation.
Mm.
And then,
Any idea? Any idea who, Mark?
well, there is an interesting article by an expert who examines airline security that basically it's easier to, without getting into all the minutiae, it's easier to mess with someone if you have some of their basic information than we'd like to think. So it could have been some sort of far right activist who wanted to mess with me. It could have been a hacker. I mean, that was the same day that President Trump met with Andy Ngo and Jack
Oh,
Posobiec and other people at the White House. The same day. So it's hard not to see that there'd be a political connection, but I don't know what it was.
yeah.
Um, and then the next
Okay.
day, I was interrogated and searched by federal agents for an hour before I left. So
Mm.
all of that certainly increased my desire to, at least for a time, have space away from the US. Although, unless things get truly awful, I'm hopeful I'm returning to teach in person in the fall at Rutgers. So we'll see
Well,
how it
I
goes.
certainly hope you return in the fall. I
Me
mean,
too.
I think it's absolutely ridiculous what has happened to you, that you have been persecuted literally for academic research. It's to
Yeah.
me, to me. So I'm just speaking in my opinion here. Michael Kenny, just professor at this point, taken off my Ridgeway has, just me as a professor, somebody who's been in this field for 25 years. Like that to me is just insane, right? That
Yeah.
you are an academic researcher
Right.
who has been forced to flee with his young family because of death threats. That
Yeah.
that is completely unacceptable in our country.
I
That's not acceptable.
I appreciate that. Yeah, and I am an activist. I've been involved in a lot of political movements, but ironically enough, the one
So
movement I have not,
that,
right, but
yeah.
just to put the finer point on it, the one movement I have not actually been involved with as an activist is anti-fascism. So, the allegation here is the thing I was writing is who I am, which in this case is not true. And here we are. But I think this is part of a broader problem with how the Trump administration and their allies are conducting politics, of just flattening all these distinctions to make everyone into their terrorist enemy.
Yeah, it's completely unacceptable. And I will say this, I'm not going anywhere.
Okay.
Good.
What do you got?
Um, yeah, it's a very, very troubling sign where actual researchers on a specific topic are the ones targeted. And so that lends one to believe that they are resistant to the information that actual credible research presents. It presents a problem to their narrative, it presents a problem to their plans. And so when you start to see that manifest the way it has in his specific case, uh it's not a good sign. And I wanted to touch on one thing. He mentioned Occupy Wall Street before. I just wanted to state that Occupy was one of the beginning stages of my journey into activism. I mean, I got arrested at Occupy Wall Street. I've been hit in the kidneys with a baton at Occupy Wall Street in New York City. And a lot of the connections today that are still active were founded and started during Occupy. And yeah, so once those people grow up and take different paths, as he took the path of in academia, and I've taken the path in activism, and we're both still targeted for what we've been saying, it's not a good sign for freedom at large.
Okay. Okay. You mentioned other research. I wanted to mention, at the risk of coming across as self-promoting, but I think you read the War in the Rocks piece that I did a few years ago with my friend and colleague of mine, who I'm not going to mention by name, I guess. But did you look at that, Comrade Rizzi?
Oh yes, I looked at it a long time ago. I think he did a
Oh,
very good job on it. I think he spoke a lot to getting an actual concrete set of digestible traits and definitions and characteristics to where we can kind of try and steer people who come and look for an answer themselves and do their own research. I think I did a great job just speaking to that in a way that that they wouldn't like.
And it's a little easier to digest than a book. So check
Yeah.
it out. I think it's called Antifa, what it is and why it matters. It was published by War on the Rocks. It was a co-authored piece with me and Colin Clark, who I will mention. It it became the second most read article on War on the Rocks, which I was kind of surprised. But okay, enough self-promotion. Let's get to our other questions. So I do see some questions. Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you just for being here, right? Just thank you for taking the time out of your busy days to join us. We appreciate it. So I see a question from one of my students. I'm going to prioritize her. So this is a question from, I guess it's okay to mention the name. We didn't talk. Yeah, let's see. The question is, when this movement dies down, if it dies down, and I assume she means anti-fascism, how do we as a society reflect on this current period? Okay, so maybe she means fascism. How do we help extremists with de-radicalizing? How did Germany and Italy reintroduce these radicalized individuals into society? Is it possible? Okay, so I think she's talking about folks that, you know, like, have fallen victim to like they're part of what you guys are calling the fascist camp, maybe what other people would call MAGA. Let's not get too worried about the terms, but as I understand the question, she's basically saying, we get through this period. Now we have millions upon millions. And some of these people, yeah, like I'm actually on Truth Social. So I know that there's just folks out there, they've drank the Kool-Aid. I mean, it's well beyond that. So what do we do about those folks? How do we help them move on? Whether that means de-radicalization, which is a problematic concept, and it's something that we in the terrorism studies field have really struggled with. My student doesn't know this because we're talking about that tomorrow night, but yeah, it's problematic. But putting that aside, I think the broader question that we can think about is like, what do we do with folks? Let's just say we do get through this moment and American democracy is saved, but we're still going to have tens of millions of people out there that are going to think, the election's been stolen. Obviously, we can't bomb our way out of a problem like that. That's why someone like me would call it the soft side. It's not kinetic, but it's still a problem that has to be addressed. So any thoughts on how we could deal with that?
Well, I mean, oops, there we are. All right. Just as far as the historical point, uh, Germany after 45, Italy after 45, Spain after 75, they didn't do anything.
Oh,
Everyday Nazis were largely allowed to reintegrate themselves into society, and that was one of the main critiques of the kind of student leftists of the 60s was that this allegedly denazified Germany. This is out here. I'm talking more about West Germany. Is manned by the same people. There was a bit more of a thorough effort to denazify in the East, and I'm talking about the East Germany, behind the Iron Curtain. But even there,
yeah.
like the main point historically after the war was how do we get these states and these economies up and running, not for the most part, how do we punish Nazis or fascists? I mean, obviously the Nuremberg trials were exceptional. Some of the most heinous figures were targeted. But here, I assume the question is more about kind of everyday people who supported
Yes.
these regimes.
Yep.
Nothing was done. Nothing was done. And I mean, Realistically, I mean, there's interesting debates about what could have been done, but nothing was done. Um, Obviously, the big part is like if you end a movement, if you end a regime, a lot of people will kind of go where the wind blows, at least in terms of what they're actually doing, apart from what they're thinking, and that would make a big difference. But education, um, political organizing, presenting alternate solutions.
You're breaking up there. I don't know if that's me or you, but
It's him.
okay, then you jump in. He gave us
Yeah.
a great start. Go.
Yeah, so he had a really good I'm glad he hit on those points. Let's not look to what we did, after World War II, because I mean we took a bunch of them and brought them over here to Project Paperclip to run our space program. I mean, it's Werner von Braun's head of NASA sent us to the moon. I would look more to the East, as he referenced, the Soviets, what they did with their Nazis. Their top Nazis they were able to get a hold of. I mean, a lot of them got denazified in a way that they could never Nazify again. Now, for the everyday people, that just comes to put them in a position to where they can actually see the other side of the coin. Most of them came to the position they were in because they were looking for the easiest set of ideas to where they could outsource their critical thinking and give it to some figure they trusted to do the critical thinking for them. And some of them never even, like most of them now, Fox News, everybody, you could go up to all the way to Donald Trump. They couldn't tell you what communism, Marxism, what any of that actually means. Like they'll call Kamala Harris like a communist or a Marxist, and it's like you can't just say any word. Like you clearly show that you do not have an understanding of what those words mean. And so I would venture to guess that most of your everyday fascist leaning people in this country really don't understand what the opposite coin, side of the coin is. Being Antifa, the antis cross each other out. That just leaves pho. You just leave yourself as the pho, the fascist. And like, if you're proud of that, then you're someone that I hope we don't meet in the streets.
Okay, great. Thank you both. Mark, welcome back.
Sorry.
Was there anything urgent that you wanted to say with respect to
Now we can move on.
We're going to move on. Okay, very good. Very good. Okay, so I want to go to another question from a friend of mine, somebody who I have a great deal of respect for. So she's asking, Rizzi stated that the left has an obligation to fight fascism everywhere it appears. There are also many on the right who oppose fascism. They have access to significant resources. What are effective ways to engage the anti-fascist right in the movement? What could be the benefits of this? What are the risks? So she wants Rizzi to start, but I'm sure, Mark, if you have any thoughts, you're welcome. Riz?
Yeah, one thing that I've been kind of thinking about lately is like, how can we all come together? Because in the left, we infight a lot, and that's a big detriment to our organization, like being able to organize effectively on a large scale. And the people on the right being anti-fascist, I see like, if there were like a coalition of some sort that had just a fundamental principle of it as, working together under the banner of a loose-knit coalition that is opposed to fascism fundamentally. And once fascism is met and stopped on a societal level, then we can all, go into fighting with each other. But like in coming together, whether it be if they're an anti-fascist right and the anti-fascist left, and finding the common enemy and realizing the threat it poses to human life, I think it needs to look something like that. Just setting aside what we don't agree with and realizing we have a problem that's threatening everybody.
Okay. Dr. Bray, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Nothing greatly of note. I mean, it's interesting historically that left-wing anti-fascism has often been very reluctant to form the kinds of coalitions that Rizzi was talking about. But certainly right-wingers who oppose the Trump administration and oppose what's going on should definitely get involved and get beyond the point of talking to actually take action.
Yeah, I want to return to that point of getting beyond talking to actual action. We still have a ways to go. Actually, I'd like to end with that. We're about an hour into it. We have about a half hour left, and we have a number of really fascinating questions here. So I hope people are still with us. Obviously, if you have class or whatever, I mean, people should feel free to go about their days, but this is a really good discussion. I want to turn to our next question, which is from an anonymous attendee. What do you think are the most urgent misconceptions about anti-fascism in the United States? And how can educators and organizers help shift public understanding? Not sure who wants to start. Maybe Mark, do you want to?
Sure, there's so much to talk about. Well, I mean, I guess just sort of definitionally, right? Antifa refers to a specific tendency within the larger history and politics of anti-fascism. So, you don't have to agree with everything that Antifa groups or advocates say in order to oppose fascism and a number of different traditions of anti-fascism. There's a really good book, for example, called The Black Anti-Fascist Tradition, which goes through struggles of African Americans against fascism. Did you want to show something, Michael?
No, keep going, keep going.
Yeah.
I will in a minute. Go ahead. Yep.
And
Yep.
we were talking about, right wingers who oppose fascism. So I think that, if you disagree with what some other anti-fascists are doing, do it your way, but do something. And then, of course, then there's the notion that Antifa is a single organization. We talked about how it's not. It's a decentralized politics. The notion that a significant amount, or even the majority of what members of Antifa groups do is violence. That's a small percentage of what they do. A lot of it really has to do with more with monitoring the far right, organizing in society and so forth. And then, there's a lot of confusion, I think, about the historical connection. You see a lot of times, did I cut out? Am I still there? Oh, okay. I just
Yeah,
want
we're still here. Yep,
to.
yep, you're fine.
Yeah.
Yep.
The right wing version of the history of anti-fascism is they've learned that there was a group in the early 1930s in Germany called Anti-Fascist Action, which there was, and they basically think that the entire history of anti-fascism is that group in a kind of unbroken chain up to the present. But groups have risen and fallen, the politics have changed, the modes of organization have changed, and so that the history is much more, rich and varied than that. But also, as you said, right, like anyone who opposes fascism can call themselves an anti-fascist. No one has a monopoly on that.
Yeah, yeah. That reminds me. Well, thank you for the book rec. I haven't seen that book. I'm gonna have to check it out. But when you were talking, it reminded me of this book, Militant Anti-Fascism: 100 Years of Resistance by Testa. And relatively early on in the book, he talks about liberal anti-fascism. This is on page 6. He says, liberal anti-fascism is useful at times for political connections, denigration of fascist activity in the mainstream press, and mobilizing numbers. Liberal anti-fascism is respectable and has the backing of MPs, so ministers of parliament. That's because he's writing in Europe. For here, it would be our congressmen and congresswomen, political, religious, and community groups, as well as the ear of the mainstream media. So that to me is really interesting, that he's basically saying that in this country, you can be a liberal anti-fascist. You can be somebody, hypothetically, even somebody like me, who is a big liberal. Like if there's any set of beliefs, if there's a hill that I'm willing to die on, it's liberalism, like in the classic sense, right? You
Yeah,
understand what I mean?
of course.
Right. So like that's a hill. Yeah. Okay. And this guy is saying, well, you can have liberal anti-fascist, somebody who's a liberal, but it's like, Rizzi's point earlier, it's like, I want to stop what I believe is happening in the country. Now the question, is that a thing? Can we have liberal anti-fascists?
Yeah, that has its own tradition. And part of what I think he's pointing out with that reference is that the word itself, anti-fascism, has been a mainstream term in Europe since World War II. And there's a lot of the post-war states that emerged were explicitly anti-fascist. In the US, from the Spanish Civil War onward, that was associated with the left and McCarthyism and Red Scares. And so, like, that term didn't get the same kind of public unanimity. Obviously, the US fought the Nazis. We hate fascists, but calling ourselves anti-fascist didn't get the same kind of popular momentum in the US that it did in Europe.
Interesting. Comrade Rizzi, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think a big misconception is like when you think anti-fascism, like you think, mask, face coverings, but there is a lot of different ways it can look. I mean, it is simply the resistance in any shape or form it may take to fascism. I mean, like, my grandfather was one of the original, anti-fascists. I mean, he shot tank shells at, Nazis in World War II. I mean, you mentioned Ridgway Center, Matthew Ridgway beforehand. You just mentioned yourself.
Ridgway probably commanded him.
You mentioned yourself as resisting fascism in a liberal way. Like, it can take on a lot of different forms. Like, just hearing Antifa, I mean, it's simply just resistance to fascism. And if it looks different for this person or it looks different in this way, it's still the same thing at its core, just with different operational, outcomes.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. So in other words, some anti-fascists don't look like you.
Yeah, not everyone. I don't walk around with this every day, but most anti-fascists don't ever have to, don this outfit.
Yeah, yeah, that's a fair point. All right, so since I brought it up, I got to say, so why do you feel it necessary to dress like that today?
Yeah, so like for me personally, like, so ICE will cover their face because they are ashamed of what they're doing. I'm covering my face because you've declared me a terrorist for resisting what they're doing. And we're not the same. And so if I'm ever unmasked or, a face comes behind everything I've said, I stand by it. But like if an ICE member is ever unmasked, like they know very well they would be ashamed to put their face behind the actions they've committed. So yeah, that's why I feel like I need to cover my face because I don't want to have my life ruined or my family's or anyone that I love.
Yeah, yeah, because you are an American. You are an American through and through. Okay, let's go to our next question. Many varieties of fascism thrive on a narrative of victimhood. Can you speak about the possible tensions between A, making public space unsafe for fascists, and B, playing into the hands of fascists who seek to foment chaos to justify their own violence, especially in the case when fascists have the reins of government? So it's a mouthful. I can break it down if we want, but that's the question.
Michael, I lost connection for a moment. Can you just summarize the question again? Because I missed the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. It's a question about victimization, specifically like MAGA's, we're victims, this, that, and the other thing, a big thing, right? Okay, so the question is asking, to address that because they thrive on that narrative of victimhood, okay? So when it comes to, if we start making public space unsafe for them, I would expect the victimization complex to get even bigger. Oh, this is cancel culture. I'm being canceled. Now my free speech is being violated. Yeah, that's what I think the first part of the question is getting at.
Yeah. Yeah. So certainly fascism has always, in every form, been about victimization, victimhood. And fascists have claimed that they've been victims in a variety of different ways in a variety of different times. That's true of MAGA. Now, a lot of those instances are largely or entirely fake, or at least interpreted in such a way as to be ridiculous. So, the Great Replacement theory Donald Trump believes is true, a lot of MAGA believe is true. That is essentially the conspiracy theory that Jews are trying to destroy the white race through immigration and interracial mixing, right? That
Right.
is meta victimization conspiracy theory. It's essentially the argument that the left and people of color and Jews are in coalition to commit white genocide. So what I'm trying to hammer home here is that almost no matter what anti-fascists or leftists or anyone does, they are going to have this mentality regardless. So for me, the question is not how do they think of themselves as victims in relation to what anti-fascists do, but what kinds of forms of organizing are effective in limiting their political power. That's how I see it, and sometimes that will give them a talking point or a soundbite to emphasize their victimhood. Cancel culture is an interesting example because for years they claimed to be the champions of free speech, and then, of course, unsurprisingly, when they have the opportunity to attack the speech of others, they're all too happy to do that. Turning Point USA being a great example of that. So for me, the question is what kinds of struggle are effective, whether or not they feel victimized by it or not.
Okay. Okay. Comrade Rizzi, anything to add on that first part of the question, or I can continue to the second part of that question?
Yeah, no, just the fact that if you're gonna be upset and cry victim for getting punched in the face for saying some racist shit, like I don't really feel for you. Now, however that looks, whether it's the argument in terms of its effectiveness or not, that's a different debate. But I don't know personally, wherever it shows up, like it should be met with the utmost disdain, contempt, and resistance, and it looks
Okay.
different things for different people.
Okay. But what about somebody like me? Because I mean, I was doxxed, right? A few years ago, I had been doing some research on the local scene here in the Berg, and I was always very open from the beginning, when you handing out business cards, telling people, look me up. This is who I am. I do research on this. You know, this is like the kind of stuff that I do. Check that out. Check out my other work. Um, and so for about a year, apparently nobody bothered to look me up. They're just, okay, whatever. And I would go to events and go to meetings, and I was trying to, get interviews, because the sort of research I do is you have to build trust first, right? It's no good just to go do an interview. Like a one-off interview, in my experience, they're a little problematic. But at any rate, so they ended up doxing me after about a year. I mean, which is, I mean, at the time it was upsetting, but like whatever. But yeah, I mean, what would you have to say to something like that? Is that
So,
legit? Yeah, go ahead.
sorry. So, I don't know really specifics of why. I mean, what it sounds like is you're trying to get close to, left wing organizing and activism in a way. And I think you got to look at it through the lens of realizing the repression and the consequences that people that have been opposed to either the power structures or, right wing politics in general, the consequences and repression they have faced historically, and
Yeah,
um the security culture
yeah,
that comes from that and what that
yeah,
looks like. And so that
yeah.
manifests itself in a lot of different ways. And however that came out in your set of circumstances is I
Yeah.
don't know.
Yeah.
It sucks. It's definitely scary to be doxxed, but yeah, you just got to realize the environment that you're in that kind of field of research, that it's always a possibility, and it's always a
Yeah.
possibility for people to jump to conclusions or not have all the information, or
Yeah.
err on the
Yeah.
side of caution.
Yeah. 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 Exactly. I mean, I think that's a good point. And I knew it was always a possibility. I mean, you don't literally spend years with these folks without, recognizing that this is always a possibility. I've had much scarier moments in the field dealing with other completely non anti-fascist folks. So it's like, okay, whatever. Um, but that's good. I'm glad you mentioned that. And I have to add that the reason why they came after me was because they thought that I worked for the FBI, because in my teaching and administrative role here at Pitt, because I teach in a security and intelligence studies program. It's a graduate program. Our students want to do good work for the government to help keep our country safe. So I actually had an FBI agent who wanted me to spy on local Muslim communities here in Pittsburgh. And because of this stuff, I said, no, no, I ain't doing that. But it led to some conversations, and we're like, okay, what if we just, like, leaving that aside? No, cool, that's dead. You killed it, fine. But, like, what do your students have? Like, well, actually, they want to come work for you guys. So we started doing these working groups, which did research for the Pittsburgh division of the FBI on completely separate projects, right? Completely separate. Never had anything to do with the left, let alone the far left. And so we were able to give opportunities to our students. Some of our students ended up being hired by the Bureau because of their participation. In fact, we established a bit of a pipeline. It was great. It was a great program until it came crashing down last year, but that's another story. But at any rate, thank you. Thank you for that. And I don't know if Mark, if you have any two finger things. Okay, we'll just move on to the next question then. Okay. I fully agree with Comrade Rizzi. However, I also believe the Antifa movement needs to have a common idea for the future. A decentralized structure works only when there is a clear understanding of what the movement aims to achieve beyond the goal of fighting fascism. What is the vision for the future? And then they go on, but I'm just gonna, what's the vision for the future? What's the larger vision here? And it's directed at you, Rizzi.
Yeah. So the very broad I don't want to say definition, but like stopping fascism from ever taking hold is going to leave a better future 10 out of 10 times than a future with fascism in it. So every individual has a different view of the future, what it looks like. All I can speak from is a personal view of what that looks like. I think for me personally, fascism and capitalism just are holding hands and walking us into oblivion as a species. I think that the future, in order to look a way that is beneficial for human beings in general, you need to come together and realize we need to have some sort of socialized principles and framework in order to build society upon. The idea that under capitalism that there is no such thing as too much, that there's never an end to the amount of wealth you should acquire and should aim to acquire, to the detriment of everyone around you, I think is it's a personified cancer cell in economic form. It is going to completely destroy us. And so now I think we all coming together realize that the billionaires that run everything have had a chance to make a better world, and they haven't. They've shown themselves unable to do that. And so they are leading us into destruction. And my personal view is that a better future would look, you know, in a way where capitalism and fascism were thrown into the trash bin of history. But to the broader sense of anti-fascism as a movement, it's just simply stopping fascism everywhere it pops up, and every other, you know, segment of people's beliefs is a different
Okay.
discussion.
Okay. Now, Mark, I'm sure you have something to add, but before you do, I want to bring in the latter part of his question because that relates directly to your expertise. So now it's the same person, and I'm continuing the question. He says, how can, for example, communists work alongside anarchists after fascism is defeated? I'm from Italy, and the post-war period of 1945 taught us that a united front against fascism is not enough. Fascists were reintegrated into institutional structures, and the consequences are still evident today. Dr. Bray, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the idea with most modern militant anti-fascist groups is that communists and anarchists and socialists and other like-minded radicals put aside all their different visions on the future to struggle together against fascism, which is why it's not a movement that aims toward a specific future beyond getting rid of fascism. It's one of my interview subjects likened it to a firefighting operation that you stage to prevent the house from burning down now. And then once you kind of put out the fire, then you can kind of struggle for building a better future. There is never a surefire way to avoid the tensions that inevitably emerge between different radicals with very different views on what the world should look like and how we should organize to get there. And those tensions, including those historical conflicts that have emerged during the Spanish Civil War, during the Russian Revolution, and elsewhere, are part of the reason why some people on both sides of that divide don't want to participate in pan-radical left anti-fascist organizing. Um, so those are the pitfalls, those are the realities. But the thing I would just emphasize is that's why it's not a political movement in the same way that communism is a political movement. Communism has its vision of the post-capitalist future. Militant anti-fascism is more of a kind of an in-between politics of stopping the very worst thing from happening, and then militants will pursue their own kind of vision of a future.
Okay, thank you. Rizzy, do you have anything to add to that? It's okay if you don't. We have plenty to do. Okay, very good. So the next question is primarily for Drs. Bray and Kenny. I've heard Dr. Kenny say in previous remarks that left-wing political violence is understudied in academia compared to right-wing political violence. I have said that. Should we expect this to change in the years to come because of the intense interest in Antifa? Let me just contextualize it, and Mark, you gather your thoughts, and I'll get to you in a second. So what this person is referring to is a podcast that I did a couple of weeks ago with Sasha Ingber. We had a wonderful discussion on Sasha's podcast, which deals with broadly defense, security, intelligence issues. She has a really neat audience of folks that she reaches. So I was excited to participate. And at one point in that discussion, I said, or she asked me, like, why don't we see more research on this? And so I said, that's a very good question. I think one reason for that, I said, I'm about to get myself in trouble. Maybe I'm reckless, get myself in trouble again. I said that one reason why I think we're not seeing more research by American academics on far left activism or even more broader anti-fascism. Yeah, specifically like in my field, terrorism studies, because I deal with violence a lot. So not talking about like social movement stuff, not specifically folks like me who focus on violence. Why aren't we seeing more? And I do believe that part of the answer to that is the bias of the researchers. I think that there's a lot of academics in this country who just frankly don't want to talk about that. And maybe that's wrong, and I'm happy to get pushback on that. But I do think that that is a partial explanation for why we haven't seen more research. Now, that's obviously not fair to people like Mark Bray, who's been working very hard to do research, and there's other folks out there. Going to give a shout out to Stanislav Vysotsky, right? This is a great book, really good book. He did a deep dive into the social movement. He's kind of more approaching it from a social movement perspective, so a little different interest than me, but very illuminating. So Mark, with that too long of an introduction, please, your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to see research on all sorts of topics, including all the ones you mentioned. And, certainly we all have our biases in terms of what we choose to research and not research. Um, I mean, there has been, at least in terms of like grave political violence in the US since the 70s, it's been mostly right-wing violence. I mean, like armed struggle dropped out of the American left-wing repertoire really, from the 80s onward. Um,
Yeah,
you know,
that's true. But even like you can't even see a good academic study on the third wave, folks. Like so now that so you know what I'm talking about, the third wave
Mhm.
of modern terrorists. Okay, so I don't have to go in, but basically for our audience, the 1960s, 1970s, when in the US, it was actually folks on the far left. So this is the time period of the Weather Underground, of you had your black nationalist strain going on. Really, now, those folks were engaging in way more terrorist attacks in the United States than we see today. You look at the data from the GTD, 400 attacks a year, 300. Now, most of that was property damage attacks. That's what the weather did. They would bomb the Pentagon late at night when nobody was there. They would bomb the State Department late at night when nobody was there. So even though there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of attacks, very low lethality. And you see this across the left wing groups historically. That's one of the interesting things about it, at least from my perspective, is when they do engage in political violence, they tend to target property, not people. So apologies for jumping in on that. It just seemed relevant. Back to you, Dr. Bray.
No, but like, yeah, I would like to see more research on those areas as well. So, I don't.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. That was my point. Like, there's even that period, like there's not what I would consider to be top rate historical scholarship on the third wave groups, right? You got Brian Burroughs's book, Days of Rage. That's good, but he's a journalist. He's not a social scientist. He's not a trained historian. Like, where's the research? Where's the beef? But the flip side of that, in this country, we think we know what anti-fascism is. We think we know what far left, political violence is. Do we? Do we? We don't even have good studies on this. I mean, it's starting to change. Yeah, we need more research on this. So somebody like me, what am I supposed to do? I guess I'm supposed to go to the Trump administration and say, fund me, I'll do no thanks, right? No thanks. Because like that's the thing that people don't understand is the reason why you had access to those people in this book was because of your work in the Occupy movement. They never would have talked to you otherwise. You can't have one without the other. All right, enough on that. We got to end. We're down to our last 3 minutes. We've been doing a lot of talking. And I don't know if either of you has any final thoughts you want to say addressing this topic or things more broadly. It's been a wonderful discussion that we've been engaged in. And so final thoughts.
Sure, I'll say a few words. Um, I think whether the word is terrorism or the word is anti-fascism or Antifa, as a historian, I like to be very attuned to how language is used by different political actors. And I think a lot of what's going on here with the Trump administration is trying to use words in a way that is extremely broad and extremely politically calculated. And so, a great antidote to that is reading the research and the scholarship of folks such as those that we've mentioned tonight, and understanding the very clear political goals involved in trying to demonize protest and resistance writ large, regardless of what kind of protest it is. And, I think that Rizzi has made a similar point. There's a lot of different ways to resist fascism and to make this world a better place. And if you don't like one way, try another. This is an important time for us all to get involved.
Thank you, Dr. Bray, and thank you for joining us. Comrade Rizzi, final thoughts? You're muted.
Yeah, so in speaking to anyone out there who wants to do something against fascism but doesn't know what to do or isn't comfortable in doing anything physical or risking their physical person in their activism, there's plenty of different ways to resist fascism. I just would implore you to find a way that you're comfortable with and do it, but do something. And if you are worried about your own physical safety out there in the streets, just get behind the people in all black who will fight the fascists. And instead of talking about it, I mean, we've been talking about it for an hour and a half. It's time to do something about it. I know today at 5:30 at the ICE building in Pittsburgh, there's going to be a protest. So instead of sitting and talking, let's get out, let's go, let's do it. I'll see you guys there. And let's get out in the streets and stop this.
Okay, thank you for those final thoughts. Mark Bray, Comrade Rizzi Campbells, I thank you both for joining us today. Really appreciate your thoughts. I know I've learned a lot over the last hour and a half. I hope our audience has as well.